Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I am your host, Jim Jones. So glad you joined us today. And we are continuing our discussion through the chapter 10 of the Daodejing. So this chapter, the last part of it, is really going to pull together a lot of the things that we've been talking about. And so I want to really focus on reorienting some of the basics or the core of what we've been talking about in terms of the kind of cultural context of the Tao Te Ching. So we've used this chart several times, but this will be key for understanding what we're looking at. Again, the layers that are kind of presented here are not really layers. They're just different ways that we can kind of abstract the information or separate it to try and help be more clear about what we're trying to talk about. But really, it kind of all is, and this is a core concept, it's all just one thing. So when we're talking about the Tao, at one level, what we're saying is that there's a pattern to things. There's a way of things that just happen. And this isn't something that we have to, contrive. It's just something that is. So we often talk about the law of gravity or the theory of gravity. We don't have to even know about it. We don't have to create it. We don't have to choose to follow it. We don't have a choice. It's just the way of things. And so being cognizant of those patterns, understanding those ways, is a core part of what Taoism is about, is how do we recognize and understand these aspects of the world that we find ourselves in. And then within that, we've got this idea of absence, or Wu, as the Chinese character is. We could also talk about it as without form. And it's a whole nother way we could also talk about Qi, is really that there's this underlying, maybe we could say, substance that makes up everything, but also even what we might think of as that empty space. Or another way we could talk about this is there is no nothing, right? Everything is actually something. Even if we're talking about what seems like this vacuum in space, it's still, in a sense, kind of pregnant with possibility, or this ability to generate things. And even when we're thinking from more of a quantum physics perspective, especially in the relational interpretation or the Lippe quantum gravity interpretation, all that space is actually something. This is how things like light is communicated, or the different forces that function, is there's something everywhere. And there is no view from outside. Everything is the view from inside. But then within this context, there's a differentiation that would be what we think of as with form. So tangible objects and things that we see, touch, and feel. These would be, in Chinese, yu, or presence, or with form, or sometimes they talk about the 10,000 things. And it's still made up of that same stuff, if we call it that. The absence is just in a different context. It's in a different way of perceiving it. And so it moves from absence to presence, and from presence back again. This movement back and forth is sometimes talked about as returning to the source. But another way that we've seen it talked about is the gate of heaven. And we'll recall that heaven is kind of another way of talking about nature. It's not referring to some location where deities reside, as we might think about it in more of a Western context. It's originally talking about the sky, and by extension, the cosmos, or we could even say by extension, nature itself. So this opening and closing of this womb, this gate, is how they would talk about things coming into existence and then seeming to go out of existence. And by existence, we're simply talking about presence. It's still going to exist in terms of absence, but it's now in the without form versus with form. And then when we're in that with form aspect, there is kind of like these relationships between opposites that create this yin-yang movement that is constantly trying to have balance. And this relationship between the two is not one that's necessarily of competition. It's just how things kind of balance each other out. And as the Taoists would argue, we want to work to get harmony with yin yang, to have harmony with the way of things in order to have more of a fulfilling and satisfying life. That when we try to go against the way of things, or if we get things out of balance with the yin yang, then we're going to find ourselves running into trouble, banging our head against the wall, or things not unfolding in the way that we would desire. So it's, again, when we think about desire, it's not about not having desire, as some wisdom traditions would talk about, but it's more about how do we desire rightly? How do we get that desire to be focused on the things that are going to help to move us into that state of harmony? So this would be kind of, again, that big picture overview. And then when we talk about some of the aspects of this particular chapter, chapter 10, it is getting into the question of, or the challenge of, how do we live out a worldview that, let's say the Taoist worldview, where it is pictured much like we were just looking at, with the various kind of values and goals that come with it, that may be different than how the larger culture is looking at things that we may find ourselves a part of. So this chapter has been engaging in that challenge. And so part of what the solution for this challenge is that we want to develop self-cultivation to empower us to exist in this context. And one of the tools for this we saw was mindfulness, or we could say meditation, where we are taking time to really internalize or become aware and to become more present from the perspective of understanding that the Taoists are promoting. And then we've got, in addition to that, a goal, you could say, for this idea of spontaneity. And spontaneity comes in two flavors. The one would be natural spontaneity. These would be the kinds of character traits that we seem to be just kind of born with, that enable us to, well, let's say in a modern sense, we might talk about this as evolutionary biology or psychology. And in this context, there's going to be certain factors or traits that are kind of part of human nature that we would call pro-social behaviors that help to connect people in social ways. And the Taoists would say, there's a lot that's baked in there that we need to let be expressed, that often gets shut down or blocked because of our experiences or because of social traditions that maybe work against those natural, spontaneous ways of being in the world. So they want to clear away or sometimes they'll talk about this idea of being able to forget things that we have learned, or things that maybe count for knowledge in a cultural sense, in order to get back to who are we just kind of naturally. Along with that, though, there is also the idea of cultivated spontaneity, where and we might think of this as almost like second nature, where we've internalized or learned something to the degree that we don't have to really think about it. It just kind of happens. It's kind of like becomes a second nature kind of default behavior. We talked about some physical activities that are kind of easy to recognize. Driving a car, when we're first learning, there's a lot of things you have to pay attention to and struggle with, and how do we coordinate all the actions? But then once we get it and we start doing it, all of a sudden we're driving and we don't even have to think about it. And if we do think about it, it becomes dangerous because we need to be able to focus on other things. We might find that we're maybe in the car with somebody and we get involved in a thoughtful conversation, and we drive all the way home from work and don't realize that we don't have any memory of it. It's like it just kind of autopilot took over. So this is that level of second nature. Now that's kind of a physical experience, which is certainly an aspect of spontaneity that they would value. But there's more what we might think of like character traits that we're trying to develop for this cultivated spontaneity as well. And one of the examples I used last week was trying to lead with assuming the best for other people as opposed to the worst, so that when certain things unfold and it doesn't quite make sense, that instead of defaulting to thinking the worst about this person and what they're doing, we maybe default to much more gracious way of interpreting what they've done. So these would be some of the key ways that they're looking at trying to do the self-cultivation to get to something that's going to be more of a harmonious way of being in that larger Taoist kind of framework of thinking about the nature of our lived experience in the world. So with that, let's go ahead and talk about just a couple other quick things. One of the Taoist diagnoses of the present situation is that there is an imbalance. Now, if we think about the historical context of the Daodejing, this is arising, at least in its written form, during the period of the Warring States period in China, where it had devolved into multiple states all vying for power that continues for a period of about 200 years. And so the question during this period that generated so much of the classical Taoist philosophies, including Confucianism and Taoism, is what is the solution to this chaos? How did we get here? How do we get out of it? And part of the diagnosis in this case from the Taoists was that we're suffering from the fact that there's too much yang, that there is more control, there's more domination that's happening. And because of that, things aren't working. It's become corrosive, it's become combative. And so they would say that what's needed at this point is a greater assertion of the yin. And so where the yang is more in terms of like male traits, issues of control, issues of power, the yin is more of the female traits, which had to do, from their perspective, more about this generative aspect, which means newness, which in a certain sense can also be talked about as chaos, because it's not controlled, it's novel, it's new. And how do we become more comfortable with this newness or this novelty, as well as different aspects of how the relationships work. So instead of the control, it's much more about trying to generate this compassion, and how do we find common ground. So they're saying that what's needed is to reassert more of this yin perspective in order to bring about balance. And the other key thing to keep in mind here is the yang is, at least in the symbol, is kind of depicted from the bright side, whereas the yin is from the dark side. So frequently we'll see dark being presented as a positive thing in the Daodejing because it represents yin. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, because in our culture, darkness is often associated with something negative, and that's not the case here. So then the first part of this, we want to actually look at the end of chapter 10, which is essentially going to give us the solution to the can you questions that the chapter starts off with. And maybe we can review that if we need to, some of these other questions. But just before I jump into that, any questions about that kind of very brief overview of the context? We're good?
Good.
All right. So here's how, so frequently the chapters are situated with kind of a startling opening phrase where we're kind of like, what does that mean? And then it'll kind of maybe chew on that a little bit in the end, and then it will conclude with, this is how you do it. This is the solution. This is how you work it out. So we're going to jump down to that point here, because I think it'll be a little bit easier to understand the remaining can you concepts that we haven't addressed yet. So I'll take it line by line. He starts off by saying, give birth and cultivate. So here we can already see that, again, we're taking the feminine as the ideal or the pattern that matches more clearly what's happening in the natural context, right? That one of the uh, perspectives from the Taoists, and this very well could be, something that's being preserved from more of the Paleolithic mindset that's being brought forward or preserved into this time period of the Hundred War, or the Warring States period, is that nature is amazing in the sense that it just keeps on generating. It creates, it gives birth, and it cultivates. And so we've got this imagery here now of a mother who gives birth and is cultivating or raising her children. And then it has this part: they give birth and do not possess. Now, we're going to be talking in more kind of like idealistic terms here, because this isn't always played out in every situation with mother and child. But ultimately, if a mother is trying to possess the children, there's going to be strife, because you can't really possess another person, right? So the trick, the balance here is, how do you cultivate without trying to own? How do you encourage and foster and raise and help to flourish in ways that ultimately you're going to have to let go, right? Because they're going to be their own person. They're going to, in different cultures, there's different ways that people move away from home at some point. How do you get to that point? So the female is then becoming this model of being able to actually give birth, create something, cultivate something, but ultimately not holding on to it, right? And then it says to act without dependence. Now, this isn't as easy to quite understand in my mind, this translation of it. And we're looking at the Addiss and Lombardo translation. So I'm going to bring in another one from our sister text that we look at, the Feng and English translation. But we'll see that they're saying here, work and not taking credit, which is very much in keeping with what we've seen in some of the previous chapters. So this idea of acting without dependence, right? We've got this idea of working, act. Okay, that makes sense. And then without, here they're saying dependence, the other is saying taking credit. Both are kind of developing this idea, if we kind of think with these thoughts. Okay, so if we're thinking about, let's say, a mother who's giving birth and raising her child, where are they trying to go with that? Well, it's interesting, this idea of not taking credit. If I have a son or a daughter that does well, it's easy, or not easy, I should say, but it's tempting to want to take credit for that. And people want to give you credit for that. They'll be like, oh, you did such a good job with your kids. And I think there's an element to that, but there's some really fascinating things that we can see from more of a modern psychology perspective that makes us have to like think about that a little bit. So for example, if we're in a culture that has a different accent than the parents have, let's say the parents immigrated from somewhere, the children will not have the accent of the parents. They'll have whatever the accent is of the culture that they happen to be living in. There's a lot of influence that happens in terms of how these children develop that is not simply just what the parents are doing. Now, certainly there's things that the parents can be doing that can be very disruptive to how somebody is raised and can be very damaging. But at the same time, there's a lot of influences that are actually even beyond the parents. And as we've looked at before, there's so many aspects of what makes somebody who they are that are kind of from outside of us, including outside the parents. So things like what kind of genetic information is passed on, what time and place in history, what type of, peace or warfare are they born into, what type of availability of food and shelter and protection. All these things aren't necessarily things that the parents can even control sometimes, that all go into how a child turns out the way that they turn out. the types of experience that the child has, what access to schools. So there's a lot here that we can be tempted to say, yep, I did that. But then really we need to kind of step back and recognize the same as with ourselves and the same with other people. There's a lot that I didn't have anything to do with here. And ultimately we can even get into the question, did any of it actually have to do with me? But I think we could at this point at least recognize there's an aspect that we need to separate out, that things are going to unfold in a certain way, sometimes with or without us, and we may help or hinder that process. But ultimately, it's even the process of being able to generate life. We can't really take credit for that. That's something that's just part of nature. So I think this is one of the things that they're trying to really explore when we're thinking about other aspects of life. How is it that it works with the mother and child in terms of this giving birth and cultivating, but not possessing, not trying to take credit, but simply being a part of this process and allowing it to unfold. And that's becoming part of the solution to how we live out this Taoist way of life. And then it continues with this: excel, but do not rule. I'm going to again bring in Feng in English for this. They would say leading, yet not dominating. And here is again, we can see how excel, but do not rule. This is kind of bringing out that same idea. I think that the Feng in English translation maybe states that a bit better. Very much fits in with everything that we've been seeing so far, is how do we continue to do what we do without trying to control, without trying to dominate, without trying to take credit or develop that dependence. But again, giving birth and cultivating with the idea that it's not ours. We need to be able to let go. And it concludes by saying, this is called dark Da. And we can say again, here we can recognize dark is in reference to this idea of the yin, right? It's bringing in that feminine aspect. And Da, which looks like Te, is actually, when we think about the Daodejing, this is that Da and the Daodejing. In more traditional ways of writing it, it was spelled with a T. In modern ways of spelling it, it's spelled with a D. And so you just have to, this translation is kind of keeping in place the more traditional way of writing it because it's been around for a while. So I want to break down this Da because it is a key aspect of what's happening in terms of the overall goal or thinking in terms of Taoism. But just before I jump into that, any thoughts about this opening part of how it's kind of taking this role of mother and child as a way of looking at this larger concept of acting in the world in general? What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts with the act without dependence, it sticks out more to me as codependency. Like, do not be emotionally, mentally, spiritually reliant on the child or your family. Yeah, just it's saying that to me, I think, just because of the theme of this, like create life, but don't try to control it completely, and don't be totally dependent on it. Like, let it flourish on its own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that.
I was thinking I just recently watched the Shiny You People documentary on Amazon, and that gave me a whole new perspective on how to raise children in terms of in this concept of prescription of this is exactly how you need to behave. This is your world now, versus hey, there is a bunch of worlds, bunch of ways to look at things, and my job is to introduce you, give you the opportunity, give you the best possible starting conditions that I possibly can think of or I consider as best. and it's up to you to make it, make it count.
Mm-hmm.
And we've had this conversation with our group friends many times. So it's just, when you speak about this, Jim, it's make me thinking about prescribing versus giving options.
Mm. Yeah. So what about in terms of taking this into other aspects of your life and work? How does that feel, or how does that resonate?
I think it's the mentality of humbleness. When you talk about the not taking credit, when you see, because from my perspective, when I see a successful leader, I see a leader who speaks about our team did this person, this person, and this person contributed the most to this, and we all have played a role, versus a leader who says, I have achieved us to do something, I have achieved us, or I'm responsible for achieving this. And I guess about the distribution of credit.
Mm.
But at the same time, it's super hard to say, you know what, I have worked my ass to do all this, but they didn't actually do it. It's we all did. The lack of taking responsibility for what you actually did, the too abstract of a recognition, or too abstract of accountability versus actually taking credit what you did, and which comes down to accountability on the same token, right? Like, I should take credit for what I achieved, what I have done, what I have worked hard for, acknowledging, yes, we talk about my starting conditions, acknowledging my environment that led me here, but at the same time taking accountability for, hey, I have not only achieved this, but I've also caused this, and
Mm.
I will continue to mitigate negative impacts or whatnot. It's just I think that the not take credit is when you speak about the not taking credit, it makes me thinking about the humility
Mm.
with which we should be approaching things and the bigger picture. But I still think that we should be, be held accountable and take accountability ourselves for the consequences of actions we've made or we've taken.
Gotcha. Anybody else?
I think it also just is saying, like, loosen your grip a little bit. Like, if you're trying to get something done and you're trying to have every bit of control over every piece of it, and you're trying to, like, not let people do their part, and you're trying to, tell them what to do as well, then you're not going to come out with as good of an outcome as you possibly could, because it's important for everybody to have input, because everybody lives a different life and has a different perspective and brings a different piece of diversity. And if you don't allow that, then it's not going to be something that has, like, good a good combination of qualities
Mm.
in the outcome.
Yeah. I know I was it's maybe a bit different as a man, but I do know as a father something about, the raising of children and how they are their own people. And it is a challenging thing, and it definitely affects my wife in different ways than it affects me. And I can't fully comprehend what it must be like for a woman who actually gives birth to children, what that connection is like. But I just thought this is like, they weren't messing around at this point in terms of like picking something that is at the root of, the core of life, really, in terms of this idea of reproduction, this idea of giving birth that we're cultivating, but yet we can't own, we can't possess, at least not if it's going to be healthy. And I was just like, whew, man, that is, cut to the chase right there. And then how do we take that that profound imagery and look at and think about the rest of our life from kind of that perspective is definitely a lot to chew on, or at least it is for me anyway.
You can tell too. I mean, you see it like in psychology, children who are raised with really controlling parents, they don't usually end up being like a very well-rounded and healthy adult.
Yeah. But then again, we have to also, if we're not taking credit for when they turn out good, we also, I mean, it's kind of a weird thing, because definitely in our
Yeah,
culture,
can you take credit for letting them be their own person?
yeah, I mean, and that's the thing, like, it's very complicated in our cultural context. It's very much dependent on this idea that every person is actually responsible for their actions, and we need to be able to take responsibility for that, the good or the bad. So the whole idea of not taking credit and not having ultimate responsibility really goes in the face of a lot of things of how we normally think about things. And so we have to well, it takes a lot more work to kind of sort that out, in terms of what do we mean by these different things, and how do we connect them. So yeah, we don't have to sort it all out here, but at this moment, but this is the basic framework, right?
Welcome back, Rob.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
So
Yeah, I was just gonna add, like, exactly what you're talking about, Junior. This is the whole core of my stop. This is the core of my alienation with my mother, and how her circumstances were harder. She was always she was alone and with nobody else at home by the time I left the country. So she had obviously a harder time, but she also imagined a whole new world, whole different world where I would have lived nearby. And she had the whole idea of how the rest of my life would come out to be. And I came into it and said, nope, and did my own thing. And that became just so much harder. And her reaction to that and how our relationship gets evolved around that, I think, is based a lot on the fact that this whole give birth and don't control didn't quite go well with her and her upbringing as well. So yeah, I could talk to you hours about that.
Yeah, and that's where, again, we're talking about, from the Taoist perspective, what the ideal would be, which in no lived experience is the ideal, right? Everything is some variation of that to some extreme or the other, right? Somewhere on the spectrum, I should say. And yeah, so, but I think our experiences of when it doesn't go well, as well as our experiences when they do go well, and how we share these together, helps us to understand more the importance of that idea of not possessing or not attempting to possess. So even our negative experiences can have some benefit if we allow them. So let's talk about Da. And I know it's kind of a funny sounding word for us because of how that word gets used. Da is used a little bit oddly in our culture compared to that, but it's a key concept, right? So if we're talking about the title of the Daodejing, Tao is this thing we've talked about in terms of way or pattern of things. Da, we're going to explain here in a minute. And then Jing means classic, or sometimes it's even translated as scripture. So it's like the classic book of Tao and Da. So Da is right up there with Tao. And we want to understand a little bit more about what are they trying to say with this concept. So we'll look at the character here, because it's really interesting the way it unfolds. And with Chinese characters, sometimes they are an image that's meant to represent something, like that you can see, like the image for a person is supposed to kind of look like somebody walking, like a little stick figure. But sometimes they use them for combining maybe a core concept with a sound. So it's not necessarily meant to imply the literal meaning of that character when they're combined into a single character, but it's trying to help you understand how to pronounce it, kind of. So here it seems as though, from what I can understand, that each of these elements of this symbol that are brought together into the single symbol or character are actually trying to bring each of the meanings together. And it's really interesting. So if you look at, we'll kind of divide this in half, but where we want to divide this is there's on the left-hand side, you kind of have these two downward strokes and then more of a a vertical stroke. Set that aside for a moment, and we're going to focus just on the other part of it. So going from the top down, we start off with what looks like kind of a cross at the top. That is the Chinese character for the number 10. And then you've got something that kind of looks like almost like a baby cradle, right? It's kind of, or railroad tracks or something, right? But that little piece there is actually a part of how they would symbolize the face, but in particular, it has to do with eyes. So here we have 10 eyes, and then the straight line underneath that is the Chinese character for 1. And the thought is that you've got 10 different eyes are all seeing the same thing, the one thing. So it has to do with this idea of correct or clear vision, right? 10 eyes are all seeing the one, there's agreement. Then the part that's underneath that straight line is the character for heart, or we might say mind. And so we've got this then idea of this clear vision, heart, mind. And then finally, the symbol that's off to the left is the character for taking a step or for walking. And so essentially what we could say then is that we've got the 10 eyes, or 10 plus eyes plus 1 plus the heart, mind plus step, really kind of comes together to give the idea of perfect hearted action or clear-minded action is what we're getting at with this concept of Da. So Tao is giving us this idea of the way of things, understanding the pattern of what is and how all the pieces work. And then the Da is, how do we live that out? This perfect hearted action or this clear-minded action. Does that make sense? All of that okay? All right. So from here then, let's look at the remaining can you statements and see how this kind of plays out. So the last one we left off with was, can you love people and govern the country without knowledge? So here, knowledge, it sounds kind of strange. What are they saying? That we want to not know anything or be ignorant? We want to remember that there's a suspicion about language because it's always somewhat arbitrary and it's not exactly ever like a true one-to-one relationship. And sometimes we take language to be more precise than it actually is. And so the Taoists are always having this kind of suspicion about words and what they mean and how they're used. And so here the question is, if you're going to care for the people and you're going to govern the country, and keep in mind, we're thinking again in the context of this warring states period. So the question is, how do we actually rule over or govern? And if we're going to do it from a position of loving people, then can we do that without knowledge? Knowledge in this sense is really more about this culturally defined knowledge, not necessarily not having wisdom, but maybe they're making a distinction between wisdom versus knowledge. Knowledge maybe being more technical in terms of the prescriptions that are defined by a particular cultural context. And so one of the ways that we have talked about this in the past is the idea of moral language. Moral language can be very problematic because it kind of comes with this sense of certainty, but there's not really a certainty behind it. There's not really an objectivity behind it. And because we present it as though it is certain or objective, it's used in a language sense to manipulate or control. And so here there would be this idea that if you're going to be in that position of trying to actually love and manage people or govern the country, then you have to be aware of how this language, this knowledge can be used in destructive ways if you're not aware of it, that you have to become very cognizant of how that language is being used or that knowledge is being used, even in this context of, like, let's say, more of a political setting. And this kind of thing comes up all the time, right? Where we'll use knowledge as ways to try and become almost like the new segregation, where with all the political upheaval, sometimes we'll want to figure out, well, how can we get it so that people, maybe only the educated people, are actually participating in voting? Well, then, the question becomes, well, what do you mean by educated? And what counts as, official education versus others? I mean, it gets very confusing, right? It can become another weapon, even though it sounds like a positive thing. How do we educate people? Well, when you educate people, you're shaping the way they're thinking. And that can be done in helpful ways and negative ways. Then it says, in loving the, this is another translation of this that I brought in that kind of helps bring some of this out. In loving the people and ruling the nation, can one be without manipulation? So here we see in this translation a little bit more of that's brought out.
And it rhymes. Everything, so it sounds much more powerful when it rhymes.
There you go. So then the next one is, can you open and close the gates of heaven? Now we kind of remember some of this from that returning of the source, this idea of moving from without form to form and back again is this gateway between the two, or it's almost sometimes talked about as the womb, going back and forth between in existence and out of existence, without clinging to earth. Now this is, I'm really trying to figure out where they're going with this way of doing the translation. But if with the gate of heaven, we're talking about this idea of things coming in and out of existence, then the clinging to earth might be, part of this not wanting things to change, not wanting that flow back and forth to happen. Might be where they're trying to go with this. But what's odd about this translation is it's actually bringing up the idea of actually maintaining the role of the female. So we'll look at a couple of different translations that bring that out. So the first one, again, from Feng in English: opening and closing the gates of heaven, can you play the role of woman? Now, thinking about the solution of this is going to come at the end, where there's this idea of giving birth and cultivating, but without possessing. We can see that idea maybe of that clinging to earth might be part of how they were trying to bring that out in the Addiss and Lombardo translation, but I think it kind of misses the overall theme throughout the Taoist aspect that's bringing in this concept of woman. And then in Lin's translation, the heavenly gates opening and closing, can one hold to the feminine principle? Again, it's trying to bring up this idea with that coming in and out. Can we do it from the perspective like the woman dealing with her own children? And then the next section is also a little bit ambiguous, which is very common with the way that the classical Chinese is written. And I appreciate this translation because it brings out that ambiguity. But it says, can you brighten the four directions without action? And there's a couple of different ways that we need to kind of think about this. So when it's talking about brightening the four directions, it's kind of like this illuminating might be a word that we would use that kind of is going to start to bring about the direction that this passage is going. And so the four directions, meaning in each way, can we illuminate that, is going to be a little bit more about this idea of if we get to a point where we can understand all things, is what's kind of happening with this first part. And then it's saying if we've become illuminated, if we've understood all these things, can we come from that place and then go to, and it's saying without action. So I want to look at a couple of different translations of this. So again, from Feng in English, understanding and being open to all things, are you able to do nothing? Now, the do nothing and without action on the previous translation is working with that phrase wu wei that we've used before, which literally would be translated as non-action. But when we've looked at this word before, it's looking at more of this idea of socially prescribed action. So can we act in a way that's not being controlled by these socially derived norms? Instead, can we act in a way that is more in that idea of that spontaneity, right? So if we get to a point where we've been enlightened, illuminated, and we're able to see in all directions, from that position, are we able to wu wei, act without acting, in the sense of not being conformed to those other layers that get added on to that awareness of the world through that cultural aspect of the values and goals that are set upon us. And I think I have one other translation of that too. Let's see. Yeah, and understanding clearly all directions, can we be without intellectuality? Again, it's getting to that idea of that culturally derived knowledge as opposed to more of that unfiltered knowledge, which ideally is more wisdom than tradition. And I think that brings us to the end of the chapter. Oh, one more. So this is the same passage, just one more translation. Seeing clearly in all four directions, can you not be a manipulating person? So again, this is another way they're talking about that wu wei, that culturally derived ways of acting. And I think that brings us to the end, which it did. So some thoughts on it? I know we kind of covered a lot of material this time around, but hopefully it tied together. Was it helpful to kind of look at the solution first and then go back through and look at the different can yous? Okay.
It was definitely helpful for me.
Any thoughts about this chapter now as a whole, since we've gone through it?
It feels, I definitely like the structure. I concurred there. It feels like something that, I mean, this feels like something that I've heard from how to be a good leader and how to be a good person, kind of ideas, even in the Western world, of just given option, given the humility, given the opportunities, and letting people be their own things themselves and celebrating that instead of indoctrinating and living in a cult and living in the restrictions. And this is how you should or should not be, and rather explaining the overall concepts, the benefits, the consequences, and letting people choose what worldly alignment they want to have, and choices they make and decisions they're going to make.
Yeah, it's a lot packed into this. We say chapter, but it's one page, and that's if you use the big font. But there's a lot in this one. A lot to chew on.
Yeah, that last part there was kind of bringing me back to the first part where it's like, can you let other people be their own person, but also can you be your own person? Even if you have all of this information, can you still hold true to yourself regardless?
Mm-hmm. Well, great. I'm glad this worked out and we were able to get through all that information. I know it was a lot for one setting, so hopefully that'll give you enough to chew on until next week. But at this point, I think we'll close it out. If you would like to join us, if you're watching this, you can register at www.kinship.cafe, and you'll get emails with the links to join in our Zoom conversation. And we'd love to see you here next time. Thanks, guys.